So we have a presentation by our friends at the ACLU, Gata Makoshi, and also Harold. Harold is with us. Both are going to talk with us today about their new report, And as you all know, the ACLU has been longtime BGEA partners. Their data we frequently cite. We also take a cue from a lot of their policy work. And so to have them here today is a real treat, especially in light of the new report. So I'll make sure I drop that in the chat. But in the meantime, I am going to go ahead and spotlight Harold Jordan and Gata Makoshi to get us started with today's meeting.
All right, so we are presenting on a report, Student Arrests in Allegheny County, the need for transparency and accountability. This is just a little bit about who we are. So Harold Jordan and me, Gata Makushi. Harold is a nationwide education equity coordinator with the ACLU of Pennsylvania, and I'm a community advocate. So my work is primarily focused on Southwest Pennsylvania school policing, and Harold currently works with affiliates across the entire country and generally all of Pennsylvania. So the goals of our report was really to inform school administrators, board members, parents, students, to give details about what groups of students are disproportionately arrested and about the gaps that exist in data reporting, provide guidance on how to address these issues, how to improve the collection and reporting of student arrest numbers, how to reduce arrests and referrals for minor infractions. So what did the data actually show us? So let's begin to look at the data that we captured in our report. School districts in Allegheny County underreported arrests to the Pennsylvania Department of Education by over 82% and over 78% to the CRDC in the 2017-18 school year. What that means is that school districts in Allegheny County reported 167 total students were arrested when there were actually 762 students arrested, 852 total arrests, as some students were arrested more than once. In 2018-19, the student arrest rate in Allegheny County was more than double the state rate and more than 3.5 times the rate of Philadelphia County. So when we looked at school districts that had the highest rate of arrest, we found that Stowe Rocks, Pittsburgh Public Schools, and South Allegheny topped the list. And over 40% of arrests we found were for minor infractions. So things like simple assault, which is a misdemeanor, may include things like fighting, threats, roughhousing, does not require any injury or even physical contact, and drug charges. 90% of those were for possession of a small amount of marijuana. This list breaks down the school districts are ranked in terms of overall arrest rates. And as you can see here, we've got Stowe Rocks at the top for the 2018-19 year, 1 out of every 24 students, Pittsburgh Public Schools, 1 out of every 34 students, and South Allegheny, 1 out of every 57. When we look at things broken down by race and then by race and gender, so focusing first on arrests of Black and white students, and we really only picked those two demographics because when we looked at arrests, 98.2% of school-related arrests were really either issued to Black or to white students. So as you can see here in the first one, Allegheny County, Black public school students were arrested at nearly 9 times the rate of white public school students during the 2018-19 school year. And then when we look at race and gender, 1 out of every 51 Black boys was arrested compared with 1 out of 316 white boys. And 1 out of every 69 Black girls enrolled in Allegheny County was arrested compared with 1 out of every 894 white girls. So there was a greater disparity between arrests of Black girls and white girls than between the Black boys and white boys. Now, when we look specifically at school districts with the highest rate of arrests of Black students and the gaps between arrests of white students and Black students, what we found were that 8 out of the top 10 school districts actually had enrollment of Black students that was less than 10%. South Allegheny School District had the highest rate of arrest where you can see here we have 1 out of every 13 Black students were arrested, compared with 1 out of every 196 white students. And then Baldwin Whitehill, you can see here 1 out of every 18. So in terms of disparities between the arrests of Black students and white students, we go into our report a little bit about why that may be. So in 2018, the US General Accounting Office did a comprehensive analysis of national data and concluded that disciplinary patterns in student engagement with law enforcement were part of a larger continuum of discipline. In other words, certain types of students were more likely to experience disproportionate punishment in all 6 major categories of discipline. That is out of school suspensions, in-school suspensions, referral to law enforcement, expulsions, corporal punishment, and school-related arrest. And that these patterns of disproportionate punishment persisted whether it was administered by schools or by police. And among the factors that contributed to the disparities in arrest rate and charges of Black student were exposure to police. So Black children were substantially more likely to attend public schools that have police officers stationed in them. Implicit bias, unconscious attitudes and stereotypes can impact how adults deal with youth. Adultification bias, which I think many of you are aware of. So some adults see Black children as less deserving of the protections traditionally afforded to young people. Black boys are seen as being older and more aggressive and threatening. Black girls are seen as being older, more mature, less in need of nurturing, and overcharging. So this is something that isn't always talked about, but this is when police or prosecutors add more serious charges than are ordinarily warranted by the situation, adding multiple charges for the same infraction, or adding charges with the goal of getting the accused person to plea bargain. So in our review of arrests in Pittsburgh public schools, we found 25 instances in which a Black student, generally a Black girl, was charged by police officers with riot, which is a felony charge, in addition to misdemeanor charges such as disorderly conduct or simple assault. So police can charge a student with riot if more than 2 students are fighting and don't cease immediately upon an order from an adult. So this charge tends to sound more serious than it often is. And similar overcharging was not seen when looking at arrests of white students. Selective punishment. So in some students, Black students are punished more frequently and more harshly than other students for the same offense. So I am going to pass it on to Harold to talk a little bit about students with disabilities.
Good afternoon, folks. We decided to take a deeper dive into the data on punishment of students with disabilities. We know that it is a nationwide problem, but what we found was actually a little bit surprising. What we found about Allegheny County was a little bit surprising, that Allegheny County is at the extreme end when it comes to punishment of students with disabilities as well. General
Okay, Kathy and I were just chatting back and forth. It looks like Harold got stuck. Got it. Were you going to jump in?
Yeah, sorry, I guess Harold did. I wasn't sure if it was just for me or if it was for everybody.
We all thought that, yeah.
Oh, okay, all right. So in terms of, we'll see if Harold jumps back on. But right, so we found greater disproportionality in arrests of students with disability, and that's defined under the IDEA. So they were arrested at much higher rates compared to national and state rates.
I'm back, by the way.
You're back, okay.
I don't know what happened, but I went away.
Okay.
I came back. So, I mean, you know, so what we found in Allegheny County was really at the extreme end compared to Pennsylvania and the national rates. And that's something that should concern all folks. When you look at moving along to the next slide, when you look at the overall rates of arrest of students with disabilities, this is generally what you see on this chart is generally what you see with the national pattern. In other words, Black boys who are students with disabilities are punished at the highest rates of any student. And that is a national trend, although once again, Allegheny County, the rate is even more extreme. You also see that Black girls with disabilities are punished at higher rates than anyone else other than Black boys. And so that's another trend of note. So, but the way to think about it generally is that Allegheny County is clearly one of the hot spots. It fits the pattern of national trends, but even more so. And it's sort of at the extreme end of the spectrum when it comes to the punishment of students with disabilities by police. This is a huge problem that is going to require a great amount of effort to sort of address and get to the bottom of. But clearly, one of the issues has to do with schools often referring students with disabilities to law enforcement. Whenever a incident occurs or something happens in a school, that the referral to law enforcement becomes sort of the sort of first choice when it comes to schools. So independently of the outcome, whether it's an arrest or a citation, there seems to be a pattern of referring, especially students with disabilities, but especially Black students with disabilities, to law enforcement to resolve as sort of an automatic thing that happens in a lot of school districts. And there are, both legal and ethical issues here. The legal issues have to do with whether kids' rights are protected, the rights that they're guaranteed under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And there's a reason to think that not all school districts are actually in compliance with their legal requirements in terms of how they serve and interact with students with disabilities. Next.
Harold, can we go back a slide if you don't mind?
Sure.
Yeah, so there's this italics down here that says this data does not include PPS as they reported 0 arrests. Can you just speak to that, please?
Yes, PPS is kind of a mess in terms of I don't know how to put it. Can't dress it up. It's kind of a mess in terms of the data that they provide to the public. So, while most of our report draws from juvenile justice data, we were unable to do that when it comes to disability because juvenile justice officials do not keep the data by disability. They do keep it by race, gender, and age, but not by disability. So we were reliant upon what school districts submit to the US Department of Education. And as it turns out that for the most recent collection of data by the US Department of Education, which covers the 17-18 school year, Pittsburgh incorrectly reported that there were 0 student arrests. And so therefore, we were unable to come up with the correct data for the arrest of Black students with disabilities for PPS. And so what you see here is a table that is based on all the other 42 districts in the county, Allegheny County.
Thank you. So would it be not too much of a reach to assume that the disparity numbers here would be higher if PPS was included?
Oh, we have every reason to believe that.
Okay.
So for example, we have seen the numbers by race, the numbers by gender, the numbers by disability, but what they don't give, what they haven't released, even in the information that's been, so let me back up. What they submitted to the government was 0. So you have no numbers for any of these when it comes to arrests. What they have released since then in other forums, such as school district meetings, school board meetings, to us in response to a right to know request, does give some data, but it doesn't give you sort of cross-sectional data. So
okay,
it doesn't
I'll
have race, gender, and disability. So, but for PPS, for the data that they have released, since the zero incident, it's pretty clear that Black students are high, students with disabilities are high. So we have every reason to think that if we had cross-sectional data, that you would end up with a table that's actually a more extreme version of this.
Gotcha. And then I see as a follow-up, Marcia just included a question in the chat where she says, can you please give an idea of the range of disabilities that are included under students with disabilities?
It's a broad range of, a pretty broad range of disabilities, but the way to think about it is that it's any disability that would create a situation where a student would receive special education services. That's kind of the way you think about it, that these are kids receiving special education services. But it's a fairly broad range of disabilities.
Thank you, Harold.
Now, let me refine that a little bit by saying that when you look at the punishment rates of Black male students with disabilities, where you find the heaviest sort of punishment, whether it's by use of out-of-school suspension or by arrest, is a Black male student with a disability, and in particular, the disability that's characterized as emotional disturbance. So that particular category is especially sort of heavy when it comes to the representation of Black male students.
All right, so I was going to move on to summary citations.
Go ahead. We'll have some time at the end.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to go over summary citations pretty quickly. And if there are more questions, we can take them at the end. But they look similar to a traffic ticket. They're issued for minor infractions, usually what we think of as typical youth behavior, categorized as disorderly conduct. So excessive noise, obscene gestures or language. They can even be issued for vaping. And so although receiving a ticket seems like a minor issue, they're actually harmful and can have long-term consequences for youth. So for starters, they're adult criminal offenses. There's no distinction between juveniles or adults when it comes to citations when you appear before the magistrate. With a citation, they are required to appear before a magistrate and are not entitled to legal counsel or provided with free legal counsel. So they may not even understand what their rights are. There's no minimum age for a citation. An arrest has a minimum age of 10. A citation can be issued at any age. We've seen them issued as young as 5. Most summary citations typically result in fines. So if youth are unable to pay these fines, then they are charged separately with what's called a failure to comply charge and automatically referred to juvenile justice. Within Pennsylvania, failure to comply is the #1 reason that youth are referred to juvenile justice. So summary convictions are not automatically expunged, and a record of the summary offense conviction actually cannot be expunged until 6 months after turning 18, and only if all conditions have been met. So if, like many youth at 17 or 18, they apply for a job, college, or military, and they are asked if they have ever been convicted of a crime, they must say yes. In terms of what our data showed us, so summary citations, there is no publicly available data on summary citations. The only place that we can get this is when schools release them through either right to know requests. So currently what we have is data on Pittsburgh public schools. And you can see here that Black students in PPS were issued summary citations at nearly 6 times the rate of white students. 88% of all summary citations issued by Pittsburgh Public Police were issued to Black students, even though they account for only 53% of the data. And when we talk about inconsistencies in reporting, here's one example. So you can see here that during a legislative meeting, during a right to know request, and then during an RMC report that was commissioned by PPS, the numbers that they gave varied every time. And then I am going to, talk a little bit about I'm going to pass this over to Harold to talk about data, the importance of accurate data, and our recommendations and implementation guide.
Well, simply stated, if you don't have accurate data, then you can't understand the problem. You can't see that there's a problem, you can't understand it. And that has implications for what school districts do and for what the public can demand. So it's there clearly is a problem when it comes to some districts with the lack of transparency and the lack of sharing of information about what is going on in schools and how young people are impacted. And so that means that the public is ignorant of what is happening and who's impacted. And that, school administrators are not in the position, and people in the school who work in school buildings are not in a position to even know what's going on there. And so there really is a significant problem. We've also found that, when data is not accurate, when it's not transparent, that some particular trends, say, for example, issues affecting students with disabilities are especially hidden within school districts. And so there really is a need for local districts to do better, for the Pennsylvania Department of Education to demand that local school districts submit accurate data and make it available to the public, and for the U.S. Department of Education to demand that local districts do a better job of revealing the data on the punishment of students. And I would add that the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is the sort of the overall sort of federal education law, actually requires school districts, and including charter schools, to post referrals to law enforcement, data on referrals to law enforcement and student arrests. And that is a requirement that is an annual requirement. And so we could argue that some districts are not in compliance with federal education law when it comes to what they report about student arrest data and referral to law enforcement data. We want to sort of wrap up by sort of getting to the recommendations of the report, and sort of the way that we've organized it. We've organized a set of recommendations that span several categories. Some recommendations have to do with policies regarding how police are used in schools. Other recommendations have to do with how school district funds are used. Are they used for student support services? And still other recommendations have to do with data. So what we've done with this report, and I encourage you to pay very close attention to the last section of the report, is that we've created this pretty thorough implementation guide. And we're going to show you some sample pages from it. So for each of the recommendations of the report, we discuss, what could be done differently, who has the power to act and under what authority, how it could be done, and what's the benefit of changing your policy and practices. So we look at everything from declaring a moratorium on the use of summary citations to providing students with appropriate services and supports under federal disability law, to how police can be removed from schools, how police can be restricted from being involved in particular incidents. So this is one page out of that section where we break it down. So that's our report. There's some additional resources that you'll see. There's another page here, and there's some additional resources that you'll find helpful, and we can make this PowerPoint available to you.
Thank you all so much. I mean, the data are very helpful as well as the recommendations, because as you may know, the BGEA has been calling for certain policy change, as Harold mentioned, removing police from schools. And so having these type of data to just buttress our arguments is so important. And we have a few more questions in the chat that I wanted to share with you all. First, Nancy asks, can you talk more about the connection/relationship between non-compliance with IDEA and arrests for Black girls?
I'm not sure I understand exactly what you're getting at, Nancy.
Nancy, feel free to unmute yourself if you want to just say a bit more.
Yeah, Harold, you said that one of the things, like you said in your comments, that the non-compliant districts that are not complying with the IDA rights for Black girls may have some reflection or some impact on the arrest rates. I just thought you might be able to talk more about that. Like if Black girls were getting what they needed through the IDA process, especially for particularly for Black girls with disabilities, would the arrest rates go down? Would we see fewer disciplinary actions?
Well, first off, I made that as a broad comment, not just pertaining to Black girls, but it's a problem with students with disabilities generally. So I just want to be clear about that. And of course, arrest rates would go down if there were not a situation where kids were automatically referred to law enforcement, but received other services under IDEA. And under the Rehabilitation Act, that those arrests would go down. I mean, what we find that schools tend to do is they just tend to call law enforcement rather than even seeing, if they're complying with what's in the individualized education plan, or seeing if the individualized education plan is correct. And so when certain behaviors occur with certain students, law enforcement is automatically called in. And so if that had not been the case, but rather the district would commit to pulling together the IEP team or working in a way that's appropriate given what is known about those students, then arrests would likely go down. There's every reason to think so. And that would be true for girls and boys.
Thank you, Harold. And I see Kirsten had a question. Who can issue a citation in schools? Is it the school police, administrators, teachers? And God already answered that by saying that school police and city police can issue summary citations, though counselors issue summary citations for truancy. God, I actually have a follow-up to that. How often are both school police and city police present in schools? I mean, we're aware of school police who are part of the teachers union. From my understanding, they're actually part of, at least their PPS, the schools, but what about city police?
So city police there are mandatory infractions for which city police need to be notified. But we also know per school police, Chief Brown from the school police, that he does contact city police for multiple reasons, that he texts them to follow up on certain things, that he has called them when he knows that a student has an outstanding warrant and calls the city police to come in and arrest a student. So city police are involved far more than they actually need to be and come into their schools far more than they need to be. School police are stationed in every high school. So there's 9 and then the rest are roaming.
So Gada's comment is Pittsburgh Public Schools specific. So if you look at the other districts in Allegheny County, to the extent to which they have policing arrangements, most of those are what are called school resource officer arrangements. In other words, where the district contracts with local law enforcement to have officers placed in schools, but the officers actually don't work for the district. They work for local law enforcement. That is the predominant model outside of, a small number of districts in Pennsylvania.
That's helpful, Harold and Gada, thank you. And then Laura says, how do schools define arrest? I guess that question is marked towards, like, are there other forms of arrest outside of handcuffing a young person and taking them out of the building?
I did type something, but I think Harold might talk about this a little bit more, because there are times that a student can be arrested and then it's determined that they're under the age of 10 and can't actually be arrested. Sometimes they arrest multiple people in a fight and then determine one is actually a victim. But Harold can probably elaborate a little bit more on that.
Well, I don't think there's anything mysterious to the answer. In my answer to that question, school districts consider a student arrested when an officer says you're under arrest and takes a kid away, whether it's a school district officer or a city police or a school resource officer. Now, so I don't think that the issue is what an arrest is, the definition of arrest. What school districts are supposed to count is when incidents in which a student is told that they're under arrest and taken away and booked. Now, it is true that some of those arrests are later dropped once a student is taken to the police station and processed. Sometimes arrests are dropped for a number of reasons. Sometimes the student is under the minimum age of arrest in Pennsylvania, which is 10, and sometimes for other reasons. But at least the initial count of arrests by school districts is based on when an officer, or supposed to be based on when an officer takes a kid, say I'm arresting this kid, removes them from the building.
I see. And Laura has a follow-up where she's asking, what about those kids that aren't taken into custody, as you described, Harold, but are then still referred to juvenile court? Like, where are they being captured
Yeah,
in data, and is it included in arrests?
so there's one case where, and I talk about how I use the data from Bird's Eye View. And so there was one situation where it was the same girl, and she was 10 years old. She was arrested, referred to juvenile justice 9 times. 2 of those, on 2 days, she was arrested multiple times or referred to juvenile justice multiple times. And when I clarified this with the juvenile justice probation department, they said, yeah, the police were called in. They issued a referral to juvenile justice. They were called again for another situation the same day, issued another referral to juvenile justice, but 9 times. She had 9 referrals to juvenile justice in 1 school year. And this was for a 10-year-old Black girl.
Wow. 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 Any other questions? It just goes to how much work needs to be done. Any other questions for Harold? Or
well, I would really encourage people to look at that last section of our report, the implementation guide, which is 8 pages long and sort of breaks it down into several categories. I mean, I want to remind people that Pennsylvania law does not require schools to have police in schools. It requires reporting only certain specific incidents to police, not everything that happens in schools. And so part of the problem that you have, not just in Allegheny County, but certainly in Allegheny County, is the police are called into situations where the law doesn't require that to happen. And so, that's a fairly basic issue that needs to be taken up and sort of challenged in individual school districts.
Thank you. And just the kind of discussion that we are going to transition into in just a bit, because we know where that amount of subjectivity is allowed, implicit biases just go rampant, right? Because of the ways that our young people are seen, especially the adultification bias that Black girls are facing. So thank you so much.
Can I add one other thing?
Absolutely.
So when it comes to students with disabilities, sometimes the reason that they are automatically referred to law enforcement is that the school doesn't want to commit to providing them with services, or that the services that they would have to provide them with are expensive. So it's not always that they just dislike certain kids or have a certain bias against kids, that it becomes a convenient way of dealing with a behavior that the school district either doesn't want to deal with, doesn't want to commit the resources to deal with, or doesn't have the resources to deal with. And so that's a factor in this equation.
And there's federal protections too for suspensions and expulsions, where a student with a disability under IDEA can only be suspended a maximum, I think it's of 15 days. And so, if you can't suspend the student, you can always call the police.
Oh, wow.
I have a question.
Please.
And I don't want to get stuck on that story that you said, but I just feel like I need more information on this. That young lady, do we know whether she had a disability or not?
No, because so the report that comes from police does not document disability. The only way we would know that. So the problem is every data source gives me different pieces of information, but there's not a way to match all of those pieces to be able to figure out if that student had a disability or not. But clearly it was clearly needed support and wasn't getting it.
That's just, that story disturbed me. It just disturbed me, especially multiple times in the same day. Like, did anyone realize that this was trauma, this was snowballing, and this was more probably an adult issue than this child's issue? Sorry.
No, it just definitely.
No, I felt the same way.
It goes to the work that needs to be done. I'm looking on my screen and I see Nancy's face, and so it brought up another question that I have for you all. And as you all know, Nancy is the director of the Education Law Center. With so many, I want to use the word violations, I don't know if that's correct, of students with disabilities of their educational rights. Are there any thoughts around litigation here as the next step?
I don't know if you want to talk about that, Harold, but I would say that there is litigation. There's lots of litigation going on individually. I mean, one of the drawbacks of the federal law that protects the rights of students with disabilities, that it's individualized. So some of those legal battles are fought out over individual children. But there's certainly avenues for looking at those issues more systemically. I think that's something could be in some of the recommendations, or could be things that groups of lawyers should explore. I mean, that's labor intensive. There's some capacity that's needed to do that. But that's certainly an avenue.
Yes, and there are special education lawyers in private practice that are the lawyers that mostly handle these issues. But I really do think that there needs to be some sort of system-wide challenges. And by challenges, I don't necessarily reduce that to legal challenges. I think challenging certain kinds of practices, documenting and challenging certain kinds of practices. And here's an area where I think that advocacy could be just as effective, or I would argue even more effective than litigation, more broadly effective, in other words, for more students than individual litigation. But I think both are absolutely necessary. Because you find in cases where school districts get sued, sometimes part of the settlement is that the school district will change the procedures, for all kids who fit a certain category.
I'll just add that I have spoken to both the solicitors and to the school board at PPS numerous times about this, that the policy recommendations that we give them, that the things that we're advocating for would help minimize some of the reasons that they get sued. That if they were to take some of the things, the changes that we are recommending, they might lessen the need for people to sue them, rather than just constantly pay out lawsuits without actually fixing the issues.
I agree. And by the way, neither Goddard nor I are lawyers here. And so school districts in some ways are more willing to hear that message from non-lawyers than they are from lawyers. And so we really need a kind of inside out strategy and pushing from all sides. I mean, in other words, I don't want people to think that they have to be a lawyer prepared to engage in litigation in order to have an impact. We actually, for Goddard and I both, we place most of our energy on trying to get schools to adopt sort of good practices that keep them out of trouble. But the ACLU does sue people, by the way.
Thankfully.
I'm just saying, I mean, and people understand that. So,
we know you have legal partners.
we can be the good guys if you want to just take our advice.
But one of the avenues, Harold, that you talk about that's not litigation, that's very effective and anyone can be part of it, and God has done some of this work too, is the codes of conduct, is really limiting and structuring the policy and practices around how schools have authority to discipline students, what that is, what that looks like, what the boundaries are. And there's a lot more power in limiting the code of conduct than I think people think. And I have to say, from ELC's perspective, we see outrageous codes of conduct in the suburban school districts. I mean, we spent a lot of time investing in Pittsburgh's, which is not perfect, but there's been some improvements. But some of the suburban school districts' codes of conduct are blatantly racist, they're sexist, they don't deal with disability, and they're just open for disparities. So I think there's avenues other than litigation, and some of that is policy advocacy at a very grassroots level to look at codes of conduct.
So you just answered my question, because the follow-up is, okay, now what we gonna do? Like, what's the starting point? And so advocacy, because I know many groups, and I think I heard Harold say this, is that, this isn't like it's a new issue. Like people have been writing reports and, highlighting the lack of just even the information or access to the information, or even the information being collected. I think that that's the first thing that needs to be mandated and advocated for, is that, you know, the proper collection of data. So I don't know, I guess this is something that we probably need to, you know, make as a priority, but what are the first steps? I think, again, collectively, we have a greater voice in, you know, developing your strategy than, you know, just this individuals, even from a lawsuit standpoint, you know, like, you know, the ACLU and Education Law Center, I know that you all have that as an avenue, but what is it that we really as a collective can do to move the needle on this? And I guess that's a question, but it's also a statement, and maybe a call to action, because this, I mean, it's one of, you know, there's two issues that, and thank you, Harold and Gada, for just the work that you continuously do, but just highlighting the disparities is one thing, but even knowing that they are even greater because data is not collected correctly is even more disheartening. So
I mean, one of the things is that, I mean, I think that a school community, and by school community, I mean parents, students, administrators, everybody works in and around the school, can sit down and take an honest look at the data that is available. And, you know, ask the question about whether it records correctly what is actually going on in that school. And then look at the patterns that are identified in the data. You can pull things directly from our report, but from other sources as well. And as a community, talk about that. I mean, I remember when my kids were in elementary school that we used to have meetings to go over sort of disparities when it came to reflected in the data, when it came to sort of academic issues and academic performance. And we would talk about that and have a discussion about whether there are practices in the school that contribute to that, or is this something that is a problem at a specific grade level, et cetera. And if folks really want to undertake that kind of a sort of self-study, I can certainly point folks in the direction of some resources that help people in school communities look at data and then ask sort of substantive questions about the practices that may be contributing to data. There's a couple of specific resources I think are especially helpful, where people can look at data and analyze it at the school level, and then ask questions about the practices that may lead to that. And I think you can do that in a way that doesn't automatically, you know, start by finger pointing, but just really trying to understand what the patterns are in that school. Is a particular class? Is it a particular, or is it a particular set of teachers that need to be retrained? Is it, or are there other kinds of issues that might be addressed in a school community?
And yeah, I see what in the chat, Julie put, you know, so can the implementation guide be used as a next step? Am I understanding that correctly? And I get that. And these are kind of what the districts need to do, but how do we enforce or have them look at it, or even partner with the ACLU to use, is this like something that we could use as a platform to actually move it forward? So that's what I was saying, like, what's the next step?
Well, also, you know, we can produce an implementation guide that's separate from the, that's not buried in a 48-page report, that just pulls out those points, and you can talk about those points. I mean, we're actually this week going to be posting sort of the implementation guide as a separate entity, and I'll send you the link to that to send out to the BGEA folks.
Okay, good. There's a great question in the chat also. What's the level of parent involvement in all of this?
I always encourage parents to speak at public board hearings or email your school board members. So that happens every month. And depending on which school district you're in, PPS just started, where you could actually speak for yourself during school board hearings this month. But you can talk about changes to policy, you can talk about changes to the code of conduct, you can talk about other issues that you've seen that need to be addressed in your school district. I think people underestimate how much power parents actually have. And you have a lot of sway because in most cases, a lot of parents don't speak up. And when you do, school board members tend to listen. And if you get students to speak up, that has even more weight because students are directly impacted by a lot of the policies as well.
I would say the same thing for individual school level as well. I mean, not just going to the school board meeting, but raising it in parent meeting and community meetings as well. I mean, that's the kind of work that we did when we saw inequities impacting our children when my kids were in elementary school. They're big now. But when they were in Philadelphia public schools.
I think another next step is that how do we ensure that families and students are informed? Like, what are their rights? What are the responsibilities of school districts to hold them accountable? And some of that may be a preliminary step so that parents and families and parents feel comfortable raising those issues and know that they have a community that supports them and legal rights to stand on, or some policy recommendations if there aren't legal rights yet. But really our next step could be informing communities and families about what those are, not only what the data is and what the recommendations are, but individually. So the people that are living that every day have some sense of what's supporting them to change that, or to hold school districts accountable when they don't comply with the IDA, or they don't comply with the discipline rules, or calling out implicit bias. But I think we have to give families and communities the tools and support to be able to do that. And I don't know if that's in the implementation plan. Maybe that is, and I don't have it right in front of me. But I think that's another critical next step.
It's not in the implementation guide. I know when my kids started kindergarten, that was something that I wanted to advocate for in a welcome packet to all parents, was what are your resources? What are your rights? That's not given to parents. And I feel like it should be given to every parent, because it ends up being, oh, some parent told me and now I know what I have to do. But if they didn't, I didn't find out until years later. And I think it's in the school's best interest too, to let parents know. So yeah, I mean, that's what I would advocate for personally, is that in every welcome packet, parents are given a list of resources, supports, and what their rights are. Harold developed a student guide for what your rights are. I can link to it here with Harold.
And I see Tamir has a question.
Hi, thank you. So I'm sorry, I was like halfway through. My name is Tamara Dixon. I'm with Allegheny County Child Welfare, but I wanted to join because this is something that comes up often, the education component. And to piggyback off of what you guys just said, it's very important to give people a how-to. Often people will tag me on social media, or they'll reach out and say, this happened at my kid's school, what should I do? Schools don't give this information, unfortunately. In the student handbook, it's not on their website. So how can we become that vehicle, or what can we do to make sure that they're getting the right information? And in the meantime, is there a way that, I'm not sure, Kathy, is there a way that even on your website, there might be a link provided where people can report like the discrepancies between their schools? Because I'm getting so much conflicted information and being asked to sit and hear some of the stuff. I'm like, one district is saying this, another district is saying that, and they're the same thing, but they're complete separate outcomes or differences. And some things are immediate, right? We're seeing the increased uptick of violence in schools. We're seeing kids with mental health, right? We're seeing teachers retaliate. And so until then, what can we do? Or is there an immediate vehicle when something's triggered like this that we should be directing families or students to versus posting it on social media?
So I think that's kind of what Nancy was referring to. Like for us, no, we don't have anything yet on our website to address like what's happening specifically in schools, but we use partners such as the Education Law Center, ACLU. We refer them to those entities that, one PA, that, organizations that really focus on what's happening in the education system across various districts. So that can be just something that we can highlight or find ways to highlight even greater?
I think there's a need for more sort of workshops that are specifically for parents and caregivers. And I know that we had planned to do more of that until COVID hit and people weren't doing things in person. But there's the need to, to go ahead and do those things, even if some of them are virtually and others are in person as things open up more. That is something we've had a long-term interest in. We've also had an interest in producing just shorter, just fold out cards and things, not just long documents that address one specific issue. So for example, one issue that we know comes up in some places is that parents have trouble gaining access to their kids' records. Now, there's no reason that a school district wouldn't give parents the record. I mean, there's a clear right to do that with very few exceptions. And those exceptions are if the kid's 18 and of majority age, then they control who has access to the record. But if the kid is underage, parents have an automatic right to student records. And so there is sometimes an issue in the school discipline context of what actually appears in a kid's record. Is there something derogatory in there that folks are not aware of, or that may come to harm them later when they apply for some kind of an opportunity or apply to college, et cetera. And sometimes what's in a record is not correct. And parents and guardians have a legal right to correct something that is wrong in the record. But yet we do find some school districts where parents are interrogated as to why do you want the record? Well, no, you have a responsibility as a district to hand over that record within a very short, reasonable period of time. And so that's one issue that comes up. And there's a whole separate set of issues that comes up with regard to your rights as a parent of a student with disabilities. And there are other issues, your rights in the suspension process and the expulsion process. And so, I mean, there really is a need for, I think, sort of workshops for people in the parents and community on these various issues that come up. But I mean, let me just add that sort of when we at the ACLU talk about knowing your rights, that doesn't assume that people have the right to just do anything they want to do. I mean, so we also explain to people what the limitations are on the exercise that, and when a school district is being reasonable in saying, I'm not going to do that. But,
I agree with workshops and awareness and education. I do remember that two of my children have pretty significant special needs. Both of them have IEPs, and there were certain things that they could not be suspended for if it was in their IEP. And that was such confusing information to me. I didn't know for several years. And then the school was always arguing with me. And it was, with the help of the Peel Center that I was able to get some assistance with advocating, but that was something that the school wasn't helpful in explaining it to me. They weren't even helpful in supporting that. And I did not know. And, we have parents who do not know what they don't know, and we don't know what they don't know. So I think that spreading that information, education, and awareness would be very powerful.
Thank you, Sarah. Sarah Nevels, and I see Sarah Berg has her hand up as well.
Yes, thank you. I'm Sarah Berg with Communities in Schools. As you all know, we work in the schools throughout Allegheny County, and we have recently started to work with Jeanette. I would love to partner with the ACLU in doing some of these engagements. We have started to work with some of our schools in having parent meetings where the meetings are really focused on trying to empower the parents to advocate for their children, to learn about what their rights are, to learn about different resources in the community. And we have found them to be extremely powerful. Some of them are not necessarily met as a welcome addition to the activities that we're providing to the parents. Oftentimes the schools don't want us to speak about certain issues. One of the things we had planned on doing was to bring somebody to speak about IEPs and the parents' rights about IEPs. Many of the schools, were completely against it, didn't want us to invite our own people to come and speak, and they wanted their school representatives. And I think that there really is something to be said about how do we hold our school districts accountable for something like this? Because oftentimes what ends up happening is that we have, you know, we have all of these requirements for what they're supposed to do, what their conduct policies are supposed to be. But the bottom line is that if the people on the ground enforcing these policies are not following them, then what do you do with that? You know, and oftentimes parents who speak up end up learning the hard way that they shouldn't be speaking up, because guess what? Their child goes to school the next day and their child is punished for what the parents spoke up against. And we see that over and over again, where, you know, a parent speaks up about an injustice that happened to their child, and now their child becomes a target in that school. And then the parent is afraid to speak. And so how do we exactly hold the school districts accountable? You know, the board oftentimes is not aware of the things that are going on, or if they are aware, they're not necessarily in disagreement with the way that things are being enforced in the schools. So that to say, I would love to partner with the ACLU. You know, if somebody can reach out to me about doing this, I would love to bring somebody to some of those meetings that we're having with parents. We're having meetings once a month, and we are really trying to incorporate those meetings into every school that we're working with.
Thank you, Sarah. And I see that Gada has placed her email in the chat box. Harold, if you don't mind, please doing the same. And I am seeing Devin's comment, who says, I am a big supporter of educating the public, especially parents and community stakeholders. I would be happy to co-host any community education opportunities for my school board constituents. That's great. And Nancy Hines has her hand up. Devin, we will take you up on that for sure.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to make a comment. You know, some of these scenarios are familiar to me in Penn Hill School District, and we're working actively to eradicate these situations. Both Gada and Harold have been very helpful with us and to the process. So I applaud them for that. But something I think to consider when you're framing the problem, for us, what I've talked about maybe more behind the scenes than publicly with other people who support I need to make these changes is simply this. Consider the behavior or misconduct from a student versus that of a staff person. And how do we handle it? And I've actually done presentations with our people here where you talk about it. Okay, so if this is a union employee, they have an advocate. The advocate comes forward immediately. We can't even initiate due process until the advocate is advised. Then there's a mutually agreed upon date and time where we can meet and we can talk. And there's a lot of tiptoeing that goes around. Then perhaps there's a louder hearing. And then perhaps there's a delay as we negotiate back and forth the best settlement agreement for this particular situation. As Harold and Gada pointed out, when you think about kids, it's immediate. That discipline is so swift. We're calling the police, we're doing what we have. You know, maybe there's not even a legal guardian involved. They're in the principal's office, they're told they're going home for 3 days or what have you. But for our purposes, it's really, really been helpful. When you think of a child is not even, you know, doesn't have the experience, the level of education in most cases as our employees do, but our employees are treated like gold when they have a misstep. But the little kids were ready to railroad them and get them out of here. So I just want you to maybe think of that as a way to frame this and to address the topic. It's been helpful to us.
Thank you, Nancy.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
And thank you for your work in Penn Hills as well. Any other questions while we still have Gada and Harold? Our work here is not done. As Kathy mentioned, the question is, what is next? Or like I like to say colloquially, what is we gonna do? So we are saving time in all of our BGEA meetings moving forward to just have that conversation, especially from a policy perspective. And so we're going to transition in just a bit. But before we get there, any other questions or thoughts? Okay, thank you, Gada and Harold. You all are welcome to continue to join us. But in the meantime, we appreciate your time and just all of your hard work and advocacy as well.
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you all.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So for folks who were able to join our conversation last week, where we gave a preview to our forthcoming policy agenda, then I'm sure you remember that there are 4 areas that we are going to be working in this year and moving forward. And they are in alignment with much of what Gada and Harold spoke about. I mean, they definitely made the case for why this work is so important. So I'm going to drop those 4 areas in the chat. Hopefully they come up. One is to expand the suspension ban to include grades 3 to 5 and to implement the ban county-wide. Another is to remove police from schools and increase the number of mental health professionals. Number 3 is dress code elimination. And number 4 is to remove subjective infractions from school codes of conduct. We talked a lot about why it's so important to pinpoint the code of conduct. Okay, and in January's BGEA meeting, education meeting, you all decided that removing police from schools is the banner, and all of these other issues are really the prongs or the strategies underneath, okay? So what we wanted to do today was really drill down into how we are going to get this work done. And so we have about 21 people left with us, and we're gonna do this work in breakout groups, you all. So the breakout groups that coincide with each of these areas. So you all get to decide if you want to discuss policy strategy for getting to expanding the suspension ban, then you're going to go to group 1. If you're interested in removing police from schools and in increasing mental health supports, that's group 2. Group 3 is dress code elimination, and group 4 is codes of conduct and removing subjective infractions, okay? And I'm going to open those rooms up now. I'll rename them just in case you forget, but they do coincide with what's listed in the chat box. And you will be answering a few questions for us, okay, in each of the breakout rooms. Oh, Kathy beat me to it. Thank you so much. And you'll be answering a few questions, okay? And those questions are going to be, is this a local or state policy? And what is our first step in getting this work done, okay? So please feel free to join your breakout rooms now, and we will be in our breakout rooms for 20 minutes. And hey, everyone, welcome back. As you begin to pop back in, welcome back. Welcome back.
All righty.
All right. So let's do a report out, y'all. This meeting typically ends at 4:30, but if y'all can just give us a few more minutes, we typically ask you to hold 3 to 5 on your calendars just to be on the safe side. So we want to make sure that we report out and just have those as kind of our marching orders for our next meeting that will happen in March. So can we start with the suspension ban group first to tell us a bit about your strategy?
I'll go ahead and speak. So some of the things that we were talking about, first of all, we really think that we need more data on what the numbers are for suspension levels in that age 3 to 5, third through 5th grades. And then we were talking about reaching out and perhaps depending and asking service providers in the area to serve as the conduit for getting the information out to families, really focusing on educating families on what their rights are, what their children's rights are, and how can they advocate for changes to be made within their own school district. So engaging parents, engaging service providers, they have great access to families. So really depending and relying on many of the many of the resources that are already out there in the community and using them in this way.
Thank you, Sarah. Did you have, I'm sorry. Did you?
No, I was just going to ask if anybody else wanted to add anything to that.
It might be it's a little bit redundant, but then we'd also mention that there were handouts. It appeared that there were already handouts that have been developed by both the ACLU, 1PA, and then one of the other groups within the Black Girls Equity Alliance is also working on something. So the information to hand out may already be available or of use. And then we talked also about working at, one of the places to work would be at the state level with legislation. So to take a look at that. So.
Thank you. And I'll ask that folks, as we progress and the work moves on this year, that if you are so inclined to remain in these subgroups, and feel free to also chat in between meetings so we can actually get some teeth to our strategy. Okay, we can discuss that more next meeting. Not that you all are not busy enough. I'll just add one more thing to your to-do list. Okay, let's talk about removing police from schools and increasing the number of mental health professionals. What are some strategic steps we can take to move us in that direction?
So we talked about identifying examples at the state level for resources and guidance, and then applying them perhaps at the local level. We also just sort of took a look back and said, getting derailed from the community listening sessions and maybe getting back on board with hosting those, which would tie into what we talked about in terms of getting parents involved, and there could be an educational component of those as well. And just due to us being in a really different spot now than we were when those were first talked about having, is really focusing on increasing the support, demonstrating that works, then going back and looking at removing the police. We talked about how can we highlight the good work of Penn Hills and Perry, and can those be replicated in other schools? And then we talked about power in hiring the new superintendent and really making sure that whoever the firm is has a big focus on restorative justice, that's something that really needs to come from the top down in leadership. So if we have people and staff already prepared to advocate for that, that would be good. And then we said we have to remember our smaller districts like South Allegheny, and maybe identify the top 5 schools that we see it maybe are most need of help and support, and then approaching them and finding out more information, like who provides the police at South Allegheny, what does that look like there? I don't know if anybody else in my group, if I missed anything you thought, please.
You are an awesome note taker and reporter. I'm gonna pick you every time.
Great.
All right. Yeah, 2 things really stood out to me that both this group and the previous suspension hearing group talked about, that strategy of pinpointing certain school districts. And so I'm wondering if we could do that as a collective and determine if we can share almost a package with them of what we would like to see. And then the other thing is about the firm that's choosing the school board superintendent. That's huge. I hadn't even thought about that. Thank you, Julie, and to your entire group. Last but not least, we have Nancy's group. And Nancy, it looked like you were trying to post the recommendations in the chat, but they disappeared.
Yes, I was afraid a little bit that we were going to run out of time, and I thought we're the last group. So although I don't know if we did we do the dress code group? Did you miss one?
No, just a group. Didn't have any takers this meeting, so you all are.
So we're the next one. I don't know if anyone else, we didn't really assign a note taker. I just sort of listened, but if anyone else from my group wants to chime in, feel free. But we said one was to call attention to the data, and especially the gaps in the data, that could be some public awareness about that. Explore best practices around school codes, like are there good school codes of conduct either in the state or in other places that could be used as models. We talked about support for school administrators and school board members that need to be educated about about the codes of conduct and what we're looking at about subjective infractions. We talked about threats, disorderly conduct, other kinds of pieces of codes of conduct that are of concern, and how important it was to hear the voices of students. So maybe again, convening a listening group or a focus group to hear the voices of students that are subjected to the code. And then ultimately we had a suggestion to really think about, could you do an equity audit of codes of conduct? Is there some way that we could have a checklist? And I know those exist in other places, but really look at how can we evaluate and help families and communities evaluate the codes of conduct so they know where the subjective pieces are and where there's room for improvement. So having some tool for doing that. But I think actually the other two groups that came up with pinpointing that school districts, we talked about that too, is that the school districts that have the highest disproportionate rates might be where we want to look at the codes of conduct, to do a review of those codes of conduct specifically. And also, I mean, again, in selecting a new superintendent, the code of conduct and the commitment to looking at those restorative justice is really important for this group too. Did I miss anything, Karen, Nancy, Carrie? Feel free to add anything. Thank you.
Well,
Thank you. Kathy, you want to close us out?
I was just saying, thank you, everybody. That was some good input. It was great presentation, and we got some good next steps. Looking forward to seeing you all next month. In the meantime, just look out for your emails. We'll have the notes and the recording sent out, and continue to think about how we can work collectively and collaboratively to address some of the issues that were brought up today. So thank you.
See y'all soon. Next meeting is March 22nd.
Thanks, bye.
Bye, good people.
Good night.